Welcome back to the channel. We are here after a late night of doing FIBA Asia Cup coverage. We are transitioning naturally to the world of boxing and back to the world of boxing. John Nash is here from Hey Not the Face. Also has done some contributions for Uncrowned. Previously Bloody Elbow as well, if I'm not mistaken. We're going to talk about some serious boxing things here today. The Ali Act is a discussion that is finally being had. I was going to say widely covered, but not necessarily the case, but widely being had in terms of how the Revival Act could shape boxing moving forward. So we're going to talk about that extensively because John's done a great job of covering this independently on his Hey Not the Face Substack, blog, the podcast as well, which you can subscribe to. John, welcome. And I mean, let's get into this because the Ali Act is it's something that's being well, there's a proposal to expand it and what have you, but the expansion, I would say, is not ideal. So can you just outline briefly just what the Ali Act is, what it was intended to do, and where we are now with this supposed Revival Act, if you want to call it that?
Sure. So people are paying attention. I probably look a little distracted. I'm looking off. My mom, I'm taking care of my elderly mom, as I told the host here, as I told
Yes.
Bryan earlier. And she came by the window and I'm like, she wanted me to answer the phone. And it's like, she had a phone call. And I'm like, I will get that later. So occasionally I will look off the screen because I have the priorities here that I got to take care of.
Multitasking. Yes.
Yeah. And I'm not a good multitasker either. So there might be a lot of stuttering. There might be a lot of muttering, as in Goodfellas, little stuttering, muttering prick. But let's give this a try. The Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act was an amendment to a previous bill passed in 1996 called the Professional Boxing Safety Act. And that one, the first bill passed in 1996, addressed a lot of health and safety concerns for boxing, medical testing, licensing, stuff like that. Almost all the athletic commissions have those regulations in their state rules now, the regulations. So it's widely accepted. And after passing that, they turned their attention to something that had been an interest in boxing for decades, going back to the congressional hearings in the 1960s, which was addressing the financial protections of boxers because they'd long been exploited. And so they passed in 2000, signed into law, the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act. And what that attempted to address was several things. One, it attempted to address a disclosure that boxers were more informed of what the promoters were making. So the promoters had to disclose financial information to the boxers. It attempted to protect against what's called coercive contracts, which were contracts that Don King was specifically famous for, but others had used as well, which was that if you had, let's say, a champion and you wanted to fight the champion, he would demand that you sign a contract with him or give him options. So if you won, he promoted the champion no matter what. Also gave him tremendous leverage in negotiations, so you got great deals. Put up a firewall between the promoter and the managers. Put a firewall also between the promoter and the sanctioning organizations. Tried to reform the sanctioning organizations so they had fairer rankings and mandatories, and then finally had some contractual standardized contracts for boxers. Now, not all that came to be because they didn't put any teeth behind the sanctioning organization part. The sanctioning organization rules were just suggestions that ended up being instead of obligations. There's nothing mandatory to them. The contract's the same. ABC wrote up a standardized template contract, but there's no teeth behind it, nothing to force people to do it. And there was no real enforcement mechanism to the Ali Act. The attorney generals of the states and the U.S. Attorney General never enforce it. The only enforcement mechanism which does exist is the right of private action. So boxers themselves can go to court. And there are several cases, and it has been used. But people say the Ali Act has never done anything. Okay, that's going too far. It doesn't work nearly as well as it's supposed to, but there have been cases where boxers have sued their promoter. And actually, there's a number of cases where it never even got to court because it's so clear-cut violation that someone will write a letter, mail it to their promoter, say, I'm going to take you to court, and then they negotiate a settlement because they know they're going to lose.
Right.
So you have a number of times it's used as that sort of leverage, but it's generally limited to boxers with the means to go to lawsuit to do it themselves. So it's narrowed who's covered by it. And the one other thing that I would say that's really been effective, two things that say been really effective in the Ollie Act. You talk to people in the industry, and I've talked to numerous of them, managers, promoters, and stuff. The one part that really holds up that was effective was the ban on coercive contracts. That's in place, and because of that, you do not see in the United States what Don King used to do and what they do in MMA is basically you want to fight the champion, you're the mandatory, you want to fight the champion, you have to sign a contract with me, give me rights, give me several year long-term exclusive rights. No, the coercive contract is so clear cut that most boxers are willing to enforce it and prevent managers from taking, not managers, but promoters from taking advantage of it. So that's worked very well. And the other thing is we have to say has worked as well is even though it doesn't explicitly say promoters can have their own titles, that firewall between promoters and sanctioning organizations, if you read the legislative history, it makes it clear that promoters cannot control titles. And every time someone has suggested they're going to make a title, when AB actually was ABC, not PBC themselves that floated the idea, but when ABC apparently floated the idea of making titles for PBC, that was shot down. And lo and behold, as TKO and Zuffa Boxing are thinking of getting into boxing, they have to have a new bill put in place so they can own their own titles. And so that has been very effective. And that was intentionally done to prevent monopolization in the sport, both those. That was to prevent monopolization. So now that long prologue of the history, now we get to the what's just been introduced, the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act, which is going to amend the Professional Boxing Safety Act and basically neuter the Ali Act at the same time. And what that is, the new bill that's been introduced into Congress that introduces a couple changes to minimum standards of minimum pay and medical coverage that promoters have to offer. But the big thing in it, the whole primary purpose of that bill, obviously, is it's going to introduce something called the Unified Boxing Organization.
Yep.
That basically lets promoters get around the Ali Act by becoming something not a promoter, a unified boxing organization, and operate as the UFC and other MMA promotions do in boxing. And so that's the new bill, and that's really it. That's the big change. They want to let boxing promoters do what they did in MMA, which is illegal in boxing.
And by boxing promoters, it's really just one promoter. Ultimately, it's just TKO. Like they're the ones who are backing this. This is essentially a bill for TKO to then execute what the UFC did once upon a time and what the WWE did once upon a time, because you use the key word monopoly. And we're in an era now, just look around, not even in sports, but just business overall. Everyone at the top wants to create a monopoly, essentially. Like they want to have a stranglehold on everything. We're even seeing this with the NBA, bringing it back to sports, where they want to expand and have an NBA Europe. I don't know what they're actually going to call it yet, but they want to have a European league that, in theory, it looks like it would go head to head with the Euro League, which already exists, because the NBA wants to seemingly have everything. And I don't think monopolies are good. I don't think it's good for people to have one destination, essentially, where they can make real money, which has been the case in professional wrestling for a while, up until AEW came around, and they have money, but they're a little more disorganized and they're not as powerful as WWE is. We've seen, the death of Bellator, essentially, in mixed martial arts. PFL is trying, I guess. And, ultimately it's just kind of UFC, standing alone at the top by a wide margin. And it looks like this is going to potentially clear the pathway in boxing for TKO to have whatever they're going to eventually call that promotion, Zuffa Boxing or whatever it is. And then just everything else is going to be weakened. The club shows are going to be hurt by this, obviously. Other promoters that people have heard of, like Eddie Hearn, who's spoken out against this, we'll pull up his comments in a second, like Oscar De La Hoya, who's spoken out against this, we'll pull up his comments as well. And I just don't think the monopolies are going to be good for boxing. And the initial intention was to not allow that to happen. But now this clears the runway for that. And it seems in all likelihood like this is going to pass, is it not?
I would imagine it passes. I think they wouldn't have introduced it if they didn't think it was going to pass. They have the right president in the office, White House. They have all the Republicans will be on board. They just got to get a few Democrats in the Senate on board, and they have Ari Emanuel is the head of TKO, whose brother is Rahm Emanuel, so he has contacts and influence in the Democratic Party. And I think the giveaway was that the original Ali Act had a 2-year grace period before the law went into effect. This is a 30-day. So that suggests to me that they want to get it done by the end of the year.
Also,
and so
one of the people introducing the bill is a Democrat, and Sharice Davids.
yes, it's got
now she's not like super left leaning. You know, if you know where to find your APAC tracker.
Yeah.
But she also is one of the people who introduced this as well.
Yeah,
as well
it's
as
got
Brian Jack from Georgia.
Yeah, it's got bipartisan support, as they say, no matter even if it's one Democrat, they call that bipartisan support, but that gives it coverage. So I think that it's lined up. They think it's going to pass. I mean, you never know for sure because there's the Epstein thing seems to have derailed everything. There's all these other things that could derail congressional movement, but I think they've lined it up that they think they can get it passed pretty quickly. Obviously, I think they want to have it passed before they start doing it next year in 2026. But you're right about monopoly problem because that is the goal. Peter Thiel talks about you want a monopoly. Warren Buffett says the whole purpose you look for companies that create moats, and that's what everybody's doing nowadays. And I think that's the intent here. Now that I should know, a lot of fans might not think that's a big deal, and it might not hurt fans' experience, but I think it'll hurt boxers because we saw what happened in the UFC. And the UFC has no competition with them. And so they can pay much less. So they get to keep, the wealthy guys get to keep 80% of the revenue. The fighters get 20%. And I would like the fighters, the people that are taking brain damage for my entertainment, to get the money and have more leverage. Now, what also is worth noting is when they passed the Ali Act, they knew immediately it wasn't working. They knew it had problems. They knew what the problems were. They had a congressional report. They had Senate hearings. They had the General Accounting Office wrote up a report listing all the problems. They introduced year after year the Professional Boxing Amendment Act that fixed all these problems, that addressed the solutions, the problems, and offered solutions to all of them. And it is interesting to me that all the stakeholders opposed that bill at the time: promoters, the athletic commissions, the UFC, who lobbied heavily against that bill, even when they were only promoting MMA and had nothing to do with them. All of them oppose that. And now some people in the media, the TKO now, they will all want this new bill to pass. And no one's talking about, hey, why don't we just bring back the Professional Boxing Amendment Act and fix the Ali Act the way it was meant to be, so we can address the problems of, too many titles, not that the rankings are not objective enough, and so the proper opponents are not being given mandatories, that there's not enough co-promotion, all these issues we have with boxing, which, if you read the bill that's been introduced, it does the exact opposite. There's no co-promotion in that new bill. It's against the rules, because to be a unified boxing organization, you can have co-promotion. Both have to be signed to you. It introduces new titles, and it has no objective rankings because the promoter owns the rankings. They get to do their own rankings. So I don't know why you think the bill that doesn't address any of the problems would be the solution, but apparently they think it is.
Yeah, I saw a rumor this morning about Keith Thurman potentially fighting Virgil Ortiz in a supposed PBC versus Golden Boy card, and I'm like, oh, now you guys want to do this?
Yeah.
It feels like this could have happened before. Speaking of Golden Boy, let's get to Oscar De La Hoya's comments, because he had some things to say about this. Again, I think this could have been said much earlier, but at the same time, I guess better late than never. Here's Oscar De La Hoya from his own Instagram account on slamming the proposed changes to the Ali Act. This was posted by Everything Boxing on Twitter.
As TKO prepares to enter the boxing space, the first thing they want to do is change this act and leave fighters vulnerable. TKO needs this to change so they can implement the exact same unethical business tactics in boxing.
It's strictly business.
That they used to create a monopoly with the UFC.
Was all this legal?
Think about this. The UFC was sued by their own fighters for this unethical shit. They recently settled on a $375 million antitrust lawsuit.
Absolutely fucking not.
Over claims they used illegal practices to suppress fighters' wages.
You guys are getting paid?
And rival promoters. Their own fighters sued them over this. And after all that, they're coming to another sport and trying to do the exact same fucking thing.
So Oscar De La Hoya has not been a fan of Dana White in the past. So I think part of that is leaking into here. I will also read quickly and then toss to you Eddie Hearn, who talked about this, I believe it was last week, July 28th, so the week before, or no, it was last week, at the beginning of last week. He said, this was like a quote that stood out to me in this interview with Boxing Scene, who is not bought. So they're going to actually cover this. If I went out and came to you, Eddie Hearn said, if I went out and came out to you now and said, by the way, I'm coming to abolish the Ali Act because that's there to protect the fighters and I don't want to protect the fighters. I want to do what I want to do at any time. I'd get so much stick. And this is what's really happening kind of behind closed doors, but now it's becoming public. He explained the fighters I've spoken to have certainly raised a lot of eyebrows saying, why are you trying to abolish an act that is there to protect us and is probably not a great look? And I think, John, here's my thing with this. On one hand, it sounds like it could be too little too late. They probably should have been doing this before. But on another hand, when Turkey and his guys came into the sport, all these dudes worked with him. Like they all ran to the money right away when it was somewhat clear that at some point he was going to figure out a way to take the sport over, probably above the heads of the promoters, if that makes sense. Am I like, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I want to give Turkey all the credit for this. Well, one is because my understanding is Sela is the one really running the boxing. Sela, I should say, pronounce it. From their sovereign fund.
Yeah, he's just the figurehead, but
it's his personal, his personal little project, and he gets some influence on it. So obviously, he has a big part, and he likes probably like all the guys in boxing, he has a tremendous ego, so he likes being the front man. But so that they would give credit. The other one is obviously, I think when they contacted TKO, who with the UFC and WWE has a long history of knowing how to monopolize these things and constantly worried about how to protect their moats, defending against expansion of the Ali Act, defending against antitrust, that they put a lot of thought into this. And I think when they came on the picture, they're the ones that pitched an idea of this is how we roll up the sport. And I think I think the other thing is the promoters, I think they couldn't imagine it would actually happen. They saw the money the Saudis were offering. They all wanted a piece of that. They didn't want to acknowledge the risk. And it's only when this bill was introduced that they really realized that, yes, TKO and the Saudis together can accomplish this. And it's clear now how it's going to work and how it's going to happen. And that was eye-opening to them. We haven't seen the boxing media. You and a few other people are talking about it. A few other people seem to understand it. But a lot of the boxing media, I'm sad to say, doesn't seem, I think, to appreciate what's probably going to happen next. I don't think they and I don't want to rag on people, but Chris Mannix had a podcast, and they went through the Ali Act, and not once did they talk about the antitrust, anti-monopoly implications of the Ali Act. Not once they talk about how that was a potential outcome, because if you read the legislative history, it's pretty clear. They specifically say this is how you monopolize boxing when you do these practices. That was not brought up. So I think I think because people in boxing, if they don't follow MMA and pro wrestling and seen what happened there as much, it seems like it's impossible to do. But it's the history of boxing. If you go back before the Ali Act, you go back before the IBC of New York versus the United States versus IBC of New York case, boxing had a history of the 20th Century Sportsman Hall Club. The IBC of New York, boxing was monopolized over and over again, and people got close to doing it again later. So it's combat sports in general are ripe for monopolization. And I think, the promoters are waking up, but it might be, as you said, too little too late, because they're starving on the vine, as either they don't have TV deals or they've all been Pied Piper onto DAZN, which has no American audience.
None.
And they left the playing field clear for TKO and Saudis, who, let's remember, TKO has much more political connections and entertainment connections, media connections than any of the other promoters, all of them combined. They have the ability with their connections on just regular TV and actors and stars that they represent with the WWE and the UFC, that I am sure they can use those pieces as leverage to say, you want to negotiate with us, not other boxing promoters. You want to make space for us, because if you sign some other boxing promoter, we might not give you access to our material. And so those promoters might be in a year from now, might be in a completely different world, a world of trouble.
This is being recorded less than 24 hours after the completion of SummerSlam. Speaking of TKO, and they put Riyadh Season in the ring now in the WWE, which they've never had sponsorships on the ring before. They've started to do that now because it's just like more outwardly corporate in a different way. Obviously, publicly traded company as well. They also had an ad run for Canelo versus Crawford that's coming up. I've seen at UFC events, they advertise WWE things because of the relationship between TKO and TKO. Ultimately, like we talk about monopolies, TKO wants a monopoly on combat sports, where it's like we control the three biggest combat sports that get the most attention, be it MMA, boxing, and professional wrestling. And that's basically what this looks like. I want to continue with Eddie Hearn here because he had another interesting quote toward the end of this. For those guys talking about UFC, Zuffa Boxing, TKO, Turkey, like that whole conglomeration, if we want to call it that. For those guys, it's all about ownership and control, said Hearn. And I get it, but it doesn't work like that in boxing. You're not going to operate in a world where fighters do as they told or do as you think they should do, unless it's fighters of a particular level. And when I look at the recruitment of the league that they're trying to build, he's talking about the fighters they're talking to and the fighters I know that they've signed. They are fighters that would do whatever TKO wanted to do because of the opportunity. For the bigger names, for the bigger fights, they're just not going to do that. And fighters aren't just designed to do as they're told. They have their own brains, they have their own opinion, and they have a team of people that are there to structure a career of a fighter with a promoter. I don't know. Do you agree with this?
Well, I mean, fighters, they might not go along with it if until they have to go along with it. I mean, that's what UFC fighters, MMA fighters might not like what the UFC does, but they still sign with the UFC because that's the only place for opportunity. I think the best hope for boxing, other promoters, is if TKO and Dana White and Ari Emanuel believe their own hype that they can just build stuff from scratch. Because if you look at how they built the UFC, it wasn't, that's the Zuffa myth they created, but that's not how they did it. The fear I would have is that they will go out and sign like they already have under, Riyadh season in the Saudis, Canelo, Crawford, Usyk, the top guys, the undisputed champions. Now imagine they take those undisputed champions and then give them ring belts and throw out the other titles. And so you have several, right, the top guy in every division. Then maybe there's one or two top contenders that everybody wants to see pay, and they sign those. So all those guys are going to make a fortune, more than they ever did. They're going to pay way above the going rate and sign those fighters. But if they're doing this development league and having these other guys that are not quite as well known, but they're going through tournaments, they're going through fights, being built up as to rank guys under their own unified boxing organization's rankings, eventually, just like the Ultimate Fighter, you will get your Forrest Griffins, you'll get your fighters coming out who people don't, or should remember, the guys going in the Ultimate Fighter on the UFC were never thought of as the very best prospects. They were just some prospects, some names, and they came out of that with some attention, some awareness of them, some renown from the public. But the UFC could do that. Or TKO could do that. They could build up boxers on their promotion that are signed exclusively to TKO, to Zuffa Boxing, get them into positions where they get to be the challengers, and then the other boxers are denied the chance of fighting the top guys. And in boxing, like all combat sports, the value, the amount of money it produced is produced mostly by the top guys in the sport. The amount of interest is mostly in the top guys. I mean, look at like Canelo, Gervonta Davis, Joshua. They do multiples of anybody else in business. That's how the sport has always worked, that the top is where you generate the most revenue. The top is where you have to reach the top to become a well-known fighter to generate revenue. And so you control those guys, you control access to them, because you no longer have to follow the Ali Act in the United States. You would no longer have to, you can do coercive contracts. You can demand if you want to fight the best guy, we don't have mandatories in our ranking. So if you want to fight them, you have to sign with us, and then you have to sign a long-term exclusive deal, 10 fights, whatever, if you win. And so we are guaranteed to continually control those very top guys in the future. And that's my fear what they'll do. Because they do that, then it will not take long to have a monopoly. We can say, oh, the TKO Zuffa Boxing title doesn't matter. Well, the WBC matters because of its history. But remember, when the IBF title was introduced, it became acknowledged pretty quickly. Why? Because Holmes was the champion. Marvin Hagler was the champion. All these guys that were well-known boxers became IBF champions. And so, as someone put it aptly, and I can't remember who wrote the paper, it's the sanctioning organizations do not legitimize the titles. or the boxers legitimize the titles of the sanctioning organization. And so if they get the best guys lined up on those titles will become legitimate, and the public will only become aware of the people that beat them, because you need to beat the man to become the man. And that's how, that's how pro wrestling did it. That's how IBC of New York did in the past. And that's how the UFC did it. And I think it's a pretty clear cut path to potentially, very possibly, monopolizing boxing. I mean, maybe not completely monopolizing it, but having, maybe not the 90% control the UFC has, but 70%. That's a massive, massive amount of revenue for any industry.
Yeah, like I don't. It could, because you mentioned wrestling earlier as an example of the monopolization, if you want to call it that. And with the WWE, like they really exploded in the mid 1980s. For people who don't know this, where there was a healthy independent scene, or at the time called a territory period, the territory days, the territory era, where you would have professional wrestling promotions all different parts of the country. You had Georgia Championship Wrestling, you had Florida Championship Wrestling, you had World Class Championship Wrestling in Dallas, you had the AWA, as we mentioned before we started, in the Midwest in Minnesota. You had promotion in California. You had New York, quote unquote, which was the WWF at the time. And eventually Vince McMahon just bought out his competition, just little by little by little. There are some people you talk to who think that maybe Bill Watts would have eventually done that, or somebody else, if Vince McMahon didn't, but ultimately Vince did it. And it killed the territories to the point where in the 90s, it was WWF, WCW, you had ECW, you had what was left of the NWA, which had a lot of affiliations with these territories at one point. And that was it. And then eventually Vince McMahon and WWF bought WCW, bought ECW, to the point where they had to create their own competition, with Raw and SmackDown splitting up because they had so many wrestlers that they didn't even know what to do with. And they had multiple developmental systems. So they had their monopoly. And the independent wrestling scene hasn't been healthy in a while. In the 2000s, you still had like Ring of Honor and Chikara, but it wasn't the same as early on. And now, like, a lot of those promotions don't even exist. It's kind of WWE, AEW, and good luck with everything else. And then with MMA, obviously UFC has risen to prominence, and Pride doesn't exist, Bellator doesn't exist, and like there are other promotions where they came and went during all that. And for boxing, it looks like we could be headed there, where, I mean, Ring Magazine is part of this. Like it's part. The accounts and the company has become essentially a propaganda arm for everything that they're doing. So it's very conceivable that the Ring Magazine titles are just the titles that get folded over into this. And then what you don't have is kind of like in WWE, to compete for the WWE Championship, you're typically not a wrestler coming from New Japan Pro Wrestling in order to do that. You have to sign with the WWE in order to do that first. Same thing with MMA and the UFC. Whoever's the top person in another promotion, they have to sign with the UFC and vacate whatever title they're leaving behind from that other promotion to come here, which is to say, if this happens and they have this UBO, what's going to end up happening is, if the WBC champion wants to fight the Ring champion or whatever, the Zuffa champion, yeah, they're going to have to vacate. It's not going to be a unification like it would have been maybe at one point. They're just going to have to vacate the title. And that just makes everything where it's like, all right, you're going to have to pay. And it's going to cost more money for the consumer, because we talked about, hey, should consumers care about this? Should fans care about this? I think it's going to cost them more money, because then you're going to have to pay, for, it's going to be just subscription service after subscription service after subscription service for like different things. And the Zone's talked about getting rid of pay-per-view. We both know that they're just going to up the price for the Zone. Like, we know that that's going to happen along the way.
Yeah, it's they'll do some. I mean, they might do some predatory pricing to put others out of business, and then raise the price when they have control. I mean, look at the UFC again. It's you have a paywall for ESPN Plus right now, and Fight Pass. You want to get all the content, and then 12 to 14 events per year on pay-per-view. Never mind that a lot of those events probably should not be pay-per-view events, but they have the fans conditioned. So it's not a cheap sport to watch. Boxing's the same. They keep putting stuff on pay-per-view that probably shouldn't be on pay-per-view, but part of that is because the promoters did not work together and build up enough interest in the product to have better broadcast rights, which because they all got that was a problem too. The promoters all got their exclusive deals on these networks, and they held it as walled. They try to make them walled gardens like MMA, and it's just, the product is not as interesting. And so they hurt themselves that way. So it's hard to feel sorry for a lot of the boxing stakeholders because they put themselves in the situation.
Right.
But as the industry, I do feel bad for the boxers, even the healthy industry. I would like something between the UFC and boxing where, maybe like a UFC sanctioning organization where it's the number one sanctioning organization that ranks everybody's excited, looks at them as the exclusive, but they don't control the promoters. But you brought up the pro wrestling one's really interesting because you go through the history of why we have an Ollie Act, why boxing promoters can't control the titles. You have to go back to the International Boxing Club of New York antitrust case. And wrestling faced an antitrust case at the same time. Before, wrestling too had athletic commissions. They had boxing had the National Boxing Association, which was the predecessor to all the sanctioning organizations, where the athletic commissions got together, and they're the ones that sanctioned and made titles for the boxers. And so that was kind of basically one title. There's, the New York State Athletic Commission had their own too, but that was kind of like the one title era. And they did the same for wrestling, and wrestling kind of freaked out because they didn't want the athletic commissions to control that. So guys like Paul Bowser in the original AWA, not connected to the later one, created their fake sanctioning organization and handed out their own titles. So then the National Wrestling Alliance came along, and all the promoters got together and formed a cartel and a legal monopoly to control the title. And so they were going to be brought up as antitrust charges. But they told the FTC at the time, or the DOJ at the time, we are not we're not legitimate sport. And so they decided, well, we do not want to go after entertainment. We want to go after that's different than sporting. And so they gave them a pass on the antitrust front. Did not do what they did with the IBC of New York. And so there's no precedent set that you're using your titles to monopolize the sport, where the International Boxing Club of New York was found to be having a monopoly over championship matches. So lo and behold, you move forward. What does MMA do when the UFC shows up in the United States? They go, well, we're going to be like pro wrestling and just have our own titles. And because of that, there's this carve out that never was applied to pro wrestling, that's never applied to MMA. And so they're allowed to then engage in this behavior that monopolizes MMA. And now we are where we are, where we're now going, hey, why don't we bring that back to boxing? This thing that causes monopoly. So it's an interesting thing where the links between the three are pretty fascinating, how they apply to each other, and how, because certain rules and laws were applied to one, not the other, we get these outcomes that we are today.
We'll end on this note. For people who want to combat this in some way, be it, they don't like monopolies, or they want the boxers that they watch and are entertained by to have rights, and they care enough to, for that to happen. Just how could, I guess on two levels. One level, how could this be fought against if you're just a fan, just a consumer, perhaps just a journalist, would be to just covering this. But how could this be fought against on that level? And then on a grander level, what is the actual recourse that maybe the promoters have, that the boxers have, beyond just speaking out about it publicly now?
Well, for the public, I mean, I don't know how effective it's going to be, because again, if Donald Trump supports this, the Republican Party will probably, especially the ones in the House, will follow suit. But it would be right to your congressman. And I think too, the important thing to acknowledge is boxing does have problems, and perhaps this bill is not the solution, but could we do another bill? Could we bring back again the Professional Boxing Amendment Act that addressed the Ollie Act problems? Would be a solution. So you could ask for that too, and say, listen, I do not want this bill to go through, but if you want, introduce and do John McCain's bill that he introduced that would have fixed these problems. I think that's number one. If there's some sort of groundswell of the public, the big thing is getting the media interested in this. Unfortunately, if the media gets interested, it'll probably turn into a partisan issue where one side is against the other. That's the way we seem to divide the country now. But I think that the media, if you think about the Sarab, the conservative pundit, he wrote Tyranny Inc. This fits just in that a business gets to run the lives of their workers. It could appeal to people like that on the conservative side. It could appeal to the antitrust, anti-monopoly people. It could appeal to the pro-labor people. I think the story applies to so many different groups that you could get the message out, and hopefully gets picked up as because it serves as an analogy of what's happening to America. then they get some attention and maybe you'll get defeated. Now on the promoter side, the number one thing they could do is work together and produce a better product. Put pressure on the sanctioning organizations, right? They could do that. My fear is always the promoters always thinking for their own interest and how they can get a cut a piece of the deal and how they can take advantage of this. Yes, you can take advantage, but the number one thing you guys could work together, just like the NFL when they originally got together, is they did that to negotiate bigger TV deals, and you could do the same without being a cartel against your boxers. You could negotiate and work together to make sure you got, that you weren't going to head all the time, so you got more audience viewership on each network that maybe you got on a network like HBO did, where it's not exclusive, where there's more co-promotion, so you can get a better TV deal that way. Put a better product out. Work together to make a better product is their number one thing, and then use whatever influence you can to defeat this in Congress. A great poison pill, I think, would just amend one part, is that being a unified boxing organization does not give you an exemption from the Ali Act. It's not, you're still a promoter. You do that one thing, then unified boxing organizations, under the way they work, they couldn't offer contracts more than 1 year in length. I think that would be brilliant. I would actually support this bill if they had that the unified boxing organization's maximum length of their contracts could only be 1 year. Because I'm like, okay, great, do your system, show how great a promoters you are, but you cannot lock people into long-term contracts. And then the sanctioning organizations could just do a lot better fucking job. I mean, a lot better job. They're in fact, I would not be against maybe asking the ABC to come back and start sanctioning titles again. We get rid of the sanctioning organizations that way. I would, for boxers, my dream, and I think it's a pipe dream because MMA fighters and boxers, just the nature of the sports make this hard. Boxers could work together to create an association, which would give them leverage to lobby Congress for bills like this, would also let them, an association as standing, so they could by themselves enforce the Ali Act independently. They wouldn't need the athletic commissions. They could also create their own sanctioning organization, so they don't have to pay the fees to someone else. They would pay a fee. Maybe if they paid a sanctioning fee, it would go to something like a pension fund or something for the boxers. So that would be an option. Probably that would be the best option, to tell you the truth. The boxers do that. That's the least likely outcome, though. But I guess for the boxers is to speak out, but I am not sure, based on the experience of MMA, current boxers are not going to see the problem with this because they might make more under the new group, and it's only future generations that will suffer from the choices made by current boxers. But it is prize fighting, and so I at the same time, I can't blame them for going for the prize.
We've never been more capitalist. I think it's the thing. Like guys will ultimately just, what's the route that I can make the most money, and then just take that route. Like, and that's part of the problem, right? Like,
I can't knock boxers and promoters. That's their job. It's prize fighting. This is purely mercenary behavior by them. The people that I really get mad at are the ABC, the Athletic Commission, and especially the sanctioning organizations, because the sanctioning organizations in their bylaws, they're supposed to promote boxing. They're the ones that are there to make sure it's treated like a sport.
Right.
And they are the ones that have failed miserably at that job. That it's, that their job is to make sure it's a meritocratic process and that those titles could have been used to as regulations, as a way to influence promoters and boxers to do the right thing. But instead, they handed out multiple titles like candy. They did shitty sanctioning title rankings. They obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but very likely took payments behind the scenes under the table on behalf of certain people. But so they have failed miserably. They're the ones that have dropped the ball more than, if they had done their job, boxing wouldn't have been in the state it's in.
And I just think, like, and I've even said for years before this happened that somebody was going to try to monopolize the sport in this way, because boxing allowed it to happen. You mentioned the exclusivity deals. Like, we remember in the mid 2010s, early 2010s, for example, where it's like HBO had Top Rank and Showtime had, PBC or I guess it wasn't PBC yet. But like their exclusive deal, Golden Boy and whatever. And they would go head to head oftentimes, where we would constantly be like, hey, why doesn't this person from this promotion fight this person from this promotion, instead of them fighting these constant stay busy fights at the same exact time on the same exact evening? And then after a while, like, you just let yourself open for something like this to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense from a promoter's point of view because you have a limited number of fighters that draw a lot of money, and you're terrified if they lose, then you're down one of your limited number of fighters that draw money. And so they're very protective, but that leads to the problems we're having. And the sanctioning organizations, if they'd limited, not given out tons of extra belts, if they had the title, the rankings were as good as possible, and they made sure that the right mandatories were made, and that they were stripping people instead of letting them, like Canelo, keep the title for long periods of times without fighting against the proper opponents. Listen, I'm not one to say boxers, you have to make boxers fight. You know, they're not indentured servants. That's my problem with MMA is these guys get trapped into contracts and they're like, well, if you don't fight this person, we're just going to sit you on the shelf forever. I think boxers, you know, fighters should have the right to choose who they want to fight. But if you're a champion, you have obligations if you want to remain champion. And they never use the leverage that the championship got to make sure co-promotion and better fights get made. So that's my big gripe on that. And the promoters too, you know, that because they kept their guys in these walled gardens they tried to build, you know, it killed the ratings. Who wants to subscribe to 4 or 5 networks where all of them are against none of them are putting on the fights you really want to see? And that's been the problem. You know, boxing, combat sports, the health of combat sports can be explained pretty easily. How recent was the last big fight? And how soon is the next big fight going to happen? And if you're not, I mean, that drives everything. That drives the water cooler talk. That drives the interest. And if you're not putting on the big fights, if they're few and far between, or if they're happening in a place that no one's on a network, DAZN, no one has, or in a place, Saudi Arabia, that no one pays attention to really, that kills the media attention, then it's not in a healthy spot. That's why we're where we're at, because there's just not enough big fights. You know,
you get these long gaps. And to answer that, actually, I think the last big fight, could you really say it's Manny Pacquiao versus Mario Barrios just because of Manny Pacquiao?
Yeah. Well, that's a bigger fight, but I wouldn't call that big. I mean, the last big fights in the United States that I remember was that 2023 year, where Crawford there was Spence. A string. You know, Crawford Spence was huge. Garcia Davis had their big fan bases. Yes. That got big. And even Caleb Plant versus Canelo, or not, I mean, Spence versus Charlo, I should say, versus Canelo. That got a lot of attention, partly because there was, I think, more the anticipation of his future fights. But that was the last time I think we had a string of bigger fights in the United States. The Crawford Canelo will be big, but I don't know if it's going to be as big as it would have been if it happened a couple of years ago, because there's just not the platform hasn't been building it. The audience, you know, Canelo it's also just a weird 3 weight class really jump. It's fucking weird. It's a weird fight.
But also Canelo Alvarez is older, noticeably.
Yeah.
So I would say it's more than plausible Terrence Crawford even wins that fight.
Yeah. Although Crawford's older, he's older too, and we haven't. I mean, he's looked fresher, but we see him like once a year. It's hard to tell where he's at. I mean,
I think the only difference is that Canelo Alvarez has been a pro for 20 years and has a lot more professional rounds, a lot more than Terrence Crawford. But to your point, like that's the next big fight, and then after that, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. Maybe the next Canelo Alvarez fight, or maybe it's the next Terrence Crawford fight. None of which will be until next year. Because Canelo Alvarez is only doing May, September now, the Floyd Mayweather thing. So
we should be consistently getting several big fights per year, and then on top of it, several big-ish fights that aren't as big, but are fights that are interesting to the boxing fan base. At least, you know. And we haven't been getting them of late. And so, you know, I just remember, we all remember, well, maybe not all, I'm older than everybody else, but we remember the 90s, you know, I just remember the HBO era of boxing in the 90s and stuff. And you'd have these big, you know, Vander Holyfield and Tyson and stuff with this monster fights per year. There'd be a couple of them per year, but on, you know, Roy Jones Jr. and Tony and all these other guys were filling up the Saturday nights once a month at least on HBO. And so it just felt there's just more momentum of the sport, and we've lost a lot of that.
Like in this month, there's nothing, for example. And then next month we'll have one big fight, and then from there they'll probably do something in Saudi Arabia in November. And who knows from that point? Maybe Virgil Ortiz and Keith Thurman gets made. I wish that was made years ago, but Keith Thurman looked good in his last fight, although
Yeah.
it was against a very overmatched Brock Jarvis. But it is what it is.
Yeah, I just Thurman. I don't mean Thurman. Several. Not to brag. I like Thurman, but I liked him a lot more 4 or 5 years
More
ago.
than that, probably.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, that was the period when he was. There was a lot of throwing around. He
Yeah,
should have
yeah.
fought. There's a whole list of PBC opponents at that time.
Because Pacquiao, when he fought Pacquiao, that
Disgusting.
was even 6 years ago. At that point, and that's
Oh crap! You're right.
That's a-
Yeah, you're right. That was before.
that's only a
then.
couple fights ago because he's been injured for so long.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
for
so-
Mario Barrios since. That's John Nash. Follow the Hey Not to Face podcast, the Substack, the blog. Catch his work, and this Aliak story is not going away. So chances are he'll be doing more shows on this, and I'll probably be doing more stuff on this because this is something that will be continued to be talked about, at least for some of us in the boxing media space. Not everybody. John, appreciate you for hopping on. If you like what you heard, subscribe, and even if you didn't subscribe anyway, why not? I'll take a hate subscription if that's the case. We'll be back on the channel with more coming soon. And elsewhere on the channel, you could find some basketball coverage, some recent baseball coverage. We did some trade deadline talk, and we have some more in the world of boxing coming soon as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk again very soon.